Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes before we begin, just to let everyone kind of get in and settle down a bit. Okay, great. So I think we'll get started. It seems that the people joining us slow down a little bit, but they can join us a bit later anyway if they decide to join. So hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today, wherever you are in the world. So my name is Jessica and I'm the front of house and marketing supervisor here at Benjamin Franklin House, and I will be hosting this discussion tonight. Before I begin, I will just say that live closed captioning is available on this webinar. Please do use that if you need to. The webinar will also be recorded and available on our YouTube channel after within the next couple of weeks. So that will be fine. Angel has said, can you guys see my video? No, so all participants will be will not be visible. It will just be us three who are visible tonight, if that's okay. So no one needs to worry about that. Great. So on to today's topic. Thanksgiving is, of course, a widely celebrated national holiday that holds an esteemed position in the American cultural conscience. However, for natives, who make up around 3% of the American population, Thanksgiving holds a very different meaning. And it is these lesser known stories that we will be uncovering and unpicking tonight in the next hour. So we have two very special guests with us today who will be leading the discussions. So first up, we have Alice Hopkinson. And she is actually our graduate researcher in residence here at Benjamin Franklin House. She is also a recent graduate from an MA in cultural history at the University of Chichester, where she did take a particular interest in Benjamin Franklin himself. So thank you and welcome, Alice. We also have Breanna Gruber joining us. Breanna is a pre-professional student at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana in the US, and she is currently completing her study abroad internship here at Benjamin Franklin House, and she has been here since September and she will be finishing up in December. So welcome both. The structure of the webinar will be as follows. So first of all, Alice is going to present a history of the Thanksgiving holiday, looking at how customs, celebrations, perceptions, and even mythology of the holiday has evolved and developed over time. We'll then pass over to Breanna, Breanna is actually a Navajo whose home is within the 4 sacred mountains known as the Navajo reservation. And she will be offering her native perspective on the holiday, which will inspire us to think differently about the traditions and customs that have for far too long dominated history. They will then come back together for a discussion before we hand over to you, the audience, for any questions that you might have. So please do save them to the end, but if you have any pressing, just type them into the Q&A box and we will be sure to answer them at the end of the talks. So without further ado, over to you, Alice.
Oh, thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk you through sort of Thanksgiving as a holiday, the history, the traditions, and sort of how it's become very fableized and sort of a story, very much so, in sort of the American consciousness. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully everyone can see my presentation. So I've titled it Origin of Tradition, and we're going to be discussing the origin of the tradition of Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving as a holiday is extremely popular and widely celebrated and holds, as Jessica said, an extraordinary special place in the American social and cultural conscience. Each year, it's marked by sort of extravagant celebrations and public displays that make it one of the biggest holidays in the American calendar that even rivals sort of 4th of July and Christmas. And looking at a typical Thanksgiving, you have the dinner taking center stage, with the food being mostly produced and derived from the North American continent. You've got your autumn vegetables, sweet potatoes, corn, and obviously most importantly the turkey. And I will come back to the turkey in a second. But outside of the main dinner, the day is dominated by parade celebrations, sporting events, broadcasts that are unique to the holiday. And it seems rather fitting today that we do have the England versus USA match, and I promise I will be done before kickoff. On the whole, though, it is immensely important for a lot of families, and it's an occasion where members of families will travel across the country and sometimes even internationally to come together and spend time with their loved ones and mark this holiday period. But we do live in a modern world dominated by technology and media, and Thanksgiving is no exception to this rule. And it has been embraced fully by popular culture and cultural institutions. So the parades I mentioned are a massive part of Thanksgiving celebrations and broadcasts across the country. And many popular modern TV shows feature Thanksgiving specials, not unlike ones made to celebrate Christmas. Yet, despite this modern approach, you can see how Thanksgiving does still hold its traditional religious meaning, which is something that has remained constant since its conception. And whilst the religious manifestations of the celebration aren't exactly the same as those held by the Puritans 200, 300, 400 years ago, and the founding fathers, or even the Pilgrims, the persistence of religion and its ongoing relationship to Thanksgiving is nonetheless an example of how religion is so important to the American cultural identity today and has stayed important throughout history. Many churches offer Thanksgiving services, and it's not uncommon for families to sort of sit down and say grace at dinner to sort of speak about what they're thankful for that year. And charity as well is a massive part of Thanksgiving, with religious institutions like small local churches or bigger religious institutions such as the Salvation Army gathering together and doing food drives for people who are perhaps less fortunate and unable to sort of experience in that foundation dinner as many other people would. And now, as I said, I will be returning to the turkey, but one of the first things you may think of when you think Thanksgiving is the turkey. It's very much become synonymous with Thanksgiving, and obviously I couldn't host a talk for the Benjamin Franklin House without acknowledging Benjamin Franklin himself. And as for reasons I will explore through this talk, Thanksgiving during the 18th century and during Franklin's lifetime took on an entirely different form. There is no record or very little record of Benjamin Franklin celebrating or acknowledging a Thanksgiving that's very alike to the one that we celebrate now. But what we do have, though, is his strong endorsement of the turkey as a national symbol for America, and his own personal preference of the turkey over the bald eagle, which is the symbol of America that persists to this day. And writing to his daughter in 1784, he stated that the turkey was a bird of courage and a respectable bird, and in his eyes, now a more fitting embodiment of the founding American values and principles than perhaps the bald eagle was. So it would have been very interesting to see what the state seal would look like if that had gone Benjamin Franklin's way. But moving away from the turkey now, 2021 marked the 400-year anniversary of the supposed first Thanksgiving that celebrates the arrival of the Pilgrims in America and the settlements that they built there. And with today being Native American Heritage Day as well, it becomes more important than ever to acknowledge that the understanding of Thanksgiving that is held by a not insignificant portion of the population is rooted in very much a romanticization and exaggeration of the true events. and is more importantly harmful to Native Americans who have until alarmingly recently been omitted from this narrative. The cultural erasure and persecution of Native Americans is something that has been seriously under-examined in historiography and covered very little in historical texts, and to the amount that they should have, and is something that highlights a glaring flaw in the overall narrative of American history. And it's therefore the intention of my presentation and this talk in general to examine the story of Thanksgiving and trace its history from the supposed first Thanksgiving of 1621 through to the present day, and discuss how our perceptions and our teachings of Thanksgiving are vastly different from the historical truth, and examining how and why Thanksgiving has evolved over time. So when you talk about Thanksgiving and the voyage of the Mayflower, I will be using the term story for reasons that will become explicit as we delve further into exploring the history of Thanksgiving. Now, the most acknowledged story of Thanksgiving is that of the Pilgrims who fled to America seeking religious freedom and liberties, and is one that I'm sure you've heard countless times before. The fact that this happened with the voyage is almost undisputed, as is the telling of what happened during and immediately after the voyage, in terms of the starvation and the famine and the rampant disease that had happened through the voyage due to poor preparation and conditions, with the situation not improving once they had landed. And the winter after landing was excruciatingly difficult, with a large number of people succumbing to the cold or dying due to the lack of food, and perhaps picking up new diseases in a new environment due to the fact that their bodies were not accustomed to those conditions. Just overall, the Pilgrims found it intensely difficult in their new environment and began to struggle to fend for themselves or live off the land, and were not able to farm or fish or even hunt due to being completely sort of blindsided by this new environment. And at this point, this is where the story of Thanksgiving begins to creep in, when discussing how the Pilgrims managed to prevail and become ultimately successful in establishing a settlement and providing for themselves. And there are two main accepted understandings at this point. One iteration is that it was sort of divine intervention, and it was the Pilgrims themselves who, with the help of this divine intervention, brought the Pilgrims fortune and bestowed them with the needed knowledge, the courage, and the self-determination they needed to survive, with the other more contentious iteration being the sort of intervention and the benevolence of the Native American Wampanoag tribe, who graciously helped the Pilgrims and taught them how to become self-sufficient and live off the land. And teaching these settlers how to fish, hunt, and farm essentially saved the group from almost certain death and starvation, and a kindness that, should the record be believed, was repaid in the form of a Thanksgiving feast that consisted of that year's harvest, to which the tribe were invited to attend. But perhaps the greatest fable regarding Thanksgiving is the overall importance of this 1621 feast that is held in the cultural memory of the country. For such a supposed monumentous occasion, there's no consistent celebration of Thanksgiving until at least the late 1700s, and even that consistency was short-lived. Thanksgiving celebrations weren't uncommon at this time, and the supposed 1621 Thanksgiving, if it did occur in some capacity, is not unique or exceptional to this fact. The act of giving thanks, particularly in response to a good harvest or fortune in war, or just any sort of benevolence that could be attributed to divine intervention, was a very sort of well-practiced custom that the Pilgrims did bring over with them, as it was pre-existing in England and much of Europe at the time. And these instances would feature prayer, hymns, feastings, and just ways to celebrate the bountiful harvest, meaning it's entirely possible to speculate that the Pilgrims imported this tradition to America and took it with them on their voyage. Now, as for the 1621 Thanksgiving being celebrated as the first Thanksgiving is a little more contentious. Claims of a preceding Thanksgiving being held a few years prior in Virginia, which was settled in 1607, are recorded. And as previously mentioned, there is a glaring lack of celebration of this supposed foundational event in American history, which does beg the question of where did this all actually stem from? Now, the imported tradition of giving thanks for instances of collective good fortune was something that did persist throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, albeit sporadically. with these instances lacking any sort of connection to the 1621 feast. And they certainly made no mention of gratitude towards the Native American people, indicating that this erasure of their culture was already commencing, essentially. And colonial Thanksgiving, moving into sort of the mid to late 1700s, colonial Thanksgivings were rare examples of unity between church and government, which were more frequently celebrated on important occasions that required a degree of religious reverence, and with victory in war becoming a more prominent example of this. Franklin himself, in his letters, notes of several occasions whereby periods of thanks were observed, with one specific instance being the English victory over the Scottish in the Jacobite Rebellion. As the European settlements expanded and migrations increased rapidly, so too was the tradition of giving thanks and the Puritan continuation and observance of Thanksgiving. So as the colonies and the settlements became more populated, as too did the settlements expand, and the tradition sort of carried on and was passed down through generations. And it's at this revolutionary period, towards the end of the 1700s, that the first major shift in tone that Thanksgiving celebrations happened. So the first proclamation of thanks was issued by the Continental Congress in 1777, which with more issued the following years, and they allocated days of national prayer and for the occasions of giving thanks, with this time the occasion being affiliated less with religion or with bountiful harvests and more to acknowledge victory in war and the success of American independence that was taking root at the time, which did denote a sort of quite significant shift from Thanksgiving being more of a religious observance into something that was more social and cultural and that served an overall function. So, as I mentioned before, the Continental Congress in 1777 gave a proclamation of thanks to denote victory in war, specifically that of Saratoga, the victory over the British in Saratoga. And Washington's proclamation in 1789 denotes the next major shift in this tone. His 1789 proclamation is the first official day of Thanksgiving seen in America, and it uses language that is extremely similar and reminiscent of the language that is used in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, which was ratified earlier that year. And it reaffirms the core values of this new American Republic and affirms the ideas and principles that had seen the American colonists plunged into this ideological and later physical conflict with the British. And in his Thanksgiving proclamation, he gives thanks to an almighty God for tranquility, union, and plenty, with Washington imploring the people to be thankful for the success in forming the new American Republic and the ratification of the Constitution, which is one of the most influential founding documents in American history. His proclamation set a precedent for his successors to follow, although there is a glaring lack of mention or any association with the first Thanksgiving of 1621, which again indicates that there is this gap in where the tradition of the 1621 Thanksgiving came from and where it was and where it sits in the timeline of the tradition. But by 1789, the relationship between the European settlers, or the American colonists, and the Native Americans had been drastically soured, with the relationship being reduced to what was essentially the subjugation of the Native Americans at the hand of the American colonists. So it's little to no surprise that Washington left this mention out of his proclamation. And as I mentioned before, the increasing rate of migration from Europe meant that settlements were expanding into more and more native territory and forcing the Native Americans out of their land, meaning they were being pushed further inland as the Europeans expanded. And the attitude taken by the European settlers towards native land was greatly at odds with that held by the Native Americans, where the tribes had learned to live somewhat peacefully with each other, safe from mild warfare, and had learned to live non-invasively in the environment. The Europeans saw this land as theirs for the taking and arrived fully equipped for domination. And whilst the formation of the American Republic and of the Constitution is certainly something to be thankful for, the means through which this was acquired and the scars that still remain as a result is certainly not. But moving into the 19th century, we see the persisting of the presidential Thanksgiving proclamation. The tradition of presidents proclaiming Thanksgiving did persist until Jefferson, although his own religious beliefs conflicted and he decided not to proclaim Thanksgiving for the whole duration of his 8-year presidency. Whilst following presidents like Madison and Monroe did make efforts to proclaim Thanksgiving, Jefferson's 8-year sort of hiatus brought an end to a lot of the cultural and social mobility that Thanksgiving as a holiday had garnered. And so towards the sort of 1830s, 1840s, it was still celebrated, but very sporadically, and only at the sort of instances of governors and individual states proclaiming it when they deemed fit. But now we do skip forward a bit more into 1846, which is the next major and perhaps the most significant change in Thanksgiving and in its celebration. From 1846, a woman named Sarah Joseph Hale began campaigning to make Thanksgiving an officially recognized and nationally celebrated public holiday. For 17 years, she used her position as editor of the American Ladies magazine to write virtually every holder of public office, from state senators to local government officials and even president, letters and sort of urges to make Thanksgiving a nationally celebrated public holiday. And her letters and the letters from the supporters that she had were sent yearly to these individuals for 17 years, urging them to make Thanksgiving a public holiday. Fearing the dissolution of the American Union and seeing Thanksgiving as a way to unite the Americans and the states under an umbrella of national identity, she thought Thanksgiving was the perfect way to sort of secure a union between the states that was teetering on the edge of collapse, which it did eventually collapse essentially in 1860 with the advent of the Civil War. Now, in finding Thanksgiving as the origin for her sort of tradition, she saw the 1841 rediscovery of a letter from Edward Winslow, who was one of the leaders of the Pilgrims from the Mayflower voyage, that detailed what is now regarded by us as the first Thanksgiving of 1621. And it was from this letter that the origin of the 1621 myth begins to arise. And instead of focusing on religious sentiments, Hale saw this as an opportunity to essentially create the founding tradition that was nationalist in its sentiment, but powerful and believable enough to be adopted as a core part of the American ideology and the national identity. And the popularity of her campaign and her letter writing to then President Lincoln in the 1860s resulted in the 1863 Thanksgiving Proclamation that declared a specific date for Thanksgiving and saw it as the first official act of making Thanksgiving a national holiday. From the 1816 onwards, foundational stories featuring the Pilgrims as heralds of this American exceptionalism and paragons of Republican values of liberty became increasingly popular towards the turn of the century in the 1880s, these stories revolved heavily around the Pilgrims and romanticized their history, but glossed over the actual truth or any involvement concerning Native Americans, and instead focused on the narrative that it was the Pilgrims themselves who fostered the ideas of independence and individualism, and through the grace of God managed to pull through and survive the winter. Fictionalized versions were much more palatable than the actual truth, especially since this fictionalized account seeped into popular culture through poems, novels, and children's literature, and was soon taught in schools and celebrated as though it were the truth, which is where this misconception stems from. And as I mentioned before, there was that other Thanksgiving celebration from Virginia in the 1607 with the settlement of Jamestown, prior to the settlement in New England and the Massachusetts Bay Area. Now, there was speculation as to whether they would adopt this Thanksgiving as the first Thanksgiving as well and use that to roll along with the myth. However, the South's association with slavery and the sort of desire to sort of distance the American narrative from slavery, particularly after the Civil War, did dissuade people from wanting to sort of associate what became such a foundational part of the American narrative to this piece in their history. But as I was saying before, celebrations became geared towards children towards the end of the 19th century, the focus being on educating them on the American identity that the Pilgrims supposedly stood for, and imbuing in them the ideas central to the founding documents of the United States, similar to George Washington's proclamation in the previous century. And in many ways, by the turn of the century, Thanksgiving had become an essential and integral part of American culture and was formative to the way in which Americans saw and perceived themselves. And in many ways, it was a self-expression and therefore a celebration of their cultural and national identity. And moving forward a little bit more, in the narrative of Thanksgiving, we move to FDR and the 1930s. So recovering from the backlash of the Great Depression, Thanksgiving was in many ways a way for families to come together like they do now, but also to sort of give thanks for what they have and acknowledge their gratefulness despite the ongoing hardships. But in 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt changed the date because Thanksgiving, as it was celebrated, was held on the last Thursday of November. And for that year, it fell on the last day of the month, meaning it would shorten the holiday buying period and potentially ruin economies or mean businesses would experience less profit due to a shortened holiday buying period. The 1939 choice to shorten the Thanksgiving period resulted in a massive backlash, especially from Republicans who saw Franklin's attempts at changing the date of Thanksgiving as an affront to Lincoln and as an affront to Thanksgiving itself, which resulted in a split, meaning that between the years of 1939 and 41, there were two Thanksgivings celebrated, with some states recognizing the new date proclaimed by Franklin, some states proclaiming the old date, and some celebrating both, with the new date proclaimed by Roosevelt being dubbed as Franksgiving. The ensuing years saw the same issues occur. FDR wanted to move the date forward because it did have the financial benefits and it didn't shorten the Christmas buying period at a crucial moment for businesses that were recovering from the Great Depression. And eventually there was a settlement reached in 1941, with Thanksgiving in 1942 being the first one to have an officially recognized and ratified date. And it was the first instance of a proclamation being for businesses and seeing a more economic perspective and seeing a more sort of economic benefit towards the society than perhaps previous proclamations had been given. So whereby previous proclamations had sort of been issued to sort of unite the nation, this one was more issued to sort of prevent any sort of further economic calamity, essentially. Now, speaking of presidential proclamations, by the turn of the century and into the 1900s, they did start to be used more as a way to address the nation more informally and a way to sort of speak about ongoing issues affecting the nation. So during World War II, FDR used his proclamations throughout the course of the war to address the nation and implore them to use the time of Thanksgiving as a time of national healing, and especially after America's entry into the war in 1941, he used it as a way to sort of bolster American values and really emphasize the differentiation between good and evil, which is what essentially the fight of World War II was being done for. He was giving thanks for American safety and the preservation of American liberties, and which were core American values and something even more pertinent during a time of both economic recovery and international struggle. But moving forward, the next most prominent example of Thanksgiving proclamation being for another purpose and for the healing of the nation is in 1963 with Lyndon B. Johnson's Thanksgiving address. President Kennedy had already given a proclamation that year. However, his unfortunate death in November, on the 22nd of November that year, preceded Thanksgiving and meant that Lyndon B. Johnson was left to address the nation on Thanksgiving of that year. His address was very moving and was used as a way to move the nation forward and not backwards, and not dwell on the events that had recently transpired, and instead implored the people to use time of Thanksgiving as a way to heal and come back with a feeling of American greatness and come through stronger than ever before. So with the turn of the century and the sort of advent of Thanksgiving becoming more of a political tool, we also see Thanksgiving as a way for businesses to increase their profits and as a tool for business, particularly during the recovery from the Great Depression period. So we see businesses sponsor Thanksgiving Day parades like the ones I mentioned before that happen consistently throughout the year. The the 6 ABC parade, which has been going on since 1920, is the oldest parade, with Macy's parade and the American Thanksgiving Day parade preceding them, being the second oldest in 1924. These all feature floats that tie in with commercialism and are sponsored by businesses and promote children's cartoon characters, which, especially given the fact that Thanksgiving precedes the Christmas buying period and the sort of marks the start of the festive period, is especially important. And with all parades, it is marked with the arrival of Santa to signal the beginning of the holiday festive period, both in a familial sense, but also financial. We also have the advent of Black Friday, which sees the most important day of the year in terms of sales for many businesses, and again, marks the beginning of the festive shopping period. And with the emergence of less sort of financial traditions that become enshrined in pop culture memory, we have, like I said, the parades and sort of the advent of like TV sort of broadcasts being done to sort of commemorate Thanksgiving, and films like The Miracle on 34th Street becoming, with Thanksgiving featuring really heavily in the orientation of these events. And these new traditions emphasize fun over that of piety, indicating Thanksgiving's deviation away from its initial religious roots that it had under the Pilgrims. Now, moving into Thanksgiving for this year, Biden's proclamation given yesterday does make reference to the Wampanoag people, as did his one of the previous year, and is something that not many presidents have chosen to do before. He moves through the history of the holiday from Washington through to Lincoln and references the heroes of the pandemic, as he did last year, and those working as first responders and on the vaccine. And he ends with reaffirming the American values and a reference to religious doctrine. Now, Biden's proclamation isn't necessarily unique in the fact that it does do the traditional sort of routine of reaffirming the American values, the importance of family, and sort of giving thanks for the fortunes of the year. However, it's perhaps more pertinent considering the fact that we have in the past 2-3 years gone through such a very tumultuous time politically and socially, particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic, meaning that there is perhaps more emphasis on family and religion after this time, given that, especially during Thanksgiving in 2020, families had to spend so much time apart from each other, meaning that Thanksgiving may be coming full circle in the sense of where its importances lie and what it stands for, but it's still very much different from its original conception. And I want to end on talking about the turkey pardon, which is a very fun tradition that's held every year. So since 1973, the president has received a turkey, with the legend of the turkey pardon dating all the way back to Lincoln and his son asking him to pardon the turkey that given to them for Thanksgiving, perhaps playing into his character as the great emancipator. But this tradition progressed into a national Thanksgiving turkey presentation. JFK was the first president to spare the turkey presented to the president of the United States. But by 1970, most turkeys were then sent to petting zoos, with George H.W. Bush in 1989 making the turkey pardoning an official tradition. And they're often given quite nice names, such as this year being chocolate and chip. Which brings us to the modern day with Thanksgiving. We've come sort of full circle, really. And I just want to finish on two sort of detailing questions of whether it's evident that the teaching and story of Thanksgiving is far different from the truth, and whether there is a clear reason why. In many ways, Thanksgiving now is a romanticization of the events of Thanksgiving, and it owes to the invention of tradition in the 19th century. Hale and those campaigning for Thanksgiving to be a national holiday sought something they could be proud of and sought a shared national story. Where the US existed for such a short span of time at this point, it lacked any sort of mythology that other nations could reaffirm themselves on and sort of bolster their own national values. So her campaigning was essentially a way to find a mythology that could be retold with a flair of storytelling and could do exactly what they needed it to do at any given point in time. And now moving on to the second question. So how has the meaning of Thanksgiving changed over time? It's certainly become less religious in a traditional sense. While religious traditions still persist, its greater focus now is on consumerism, commercialism, and in many ways is representative of where we are and what we value as a society. So it would be interesting to see where this does go in the future. So I'm going to hand over to Breanna now and end my presentation here. So thank you for your time, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you. Let me just start sharing my screen. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so hello, Yate. My name is Breanna Gruber. I'm just going to be presenting the Native perspective on Thanksgiving. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about where my, I guess, understanding and perception of Thanksgiving as a holiday. As a Navajo person, I think that it's going to be very different, I guess, from what you normally see, but yeah, I just want to share that with you guys. Oh. And okay, so I'm going to start with me and our home. So our home, I'm referring to Navajo people, or the Diné. We find our home to be within the Four Sacred Mountains. That is just the mountain Hesperus Peak to the north, Blanca Peak to the east, Mount Taylor to the south, and San Francisco Peak to the west. To the west, it's sorry. To the west, it's going to be in Flagstaff. Mount Taylor is going to be in New Mexico, and then the Black and White Mountain will be in Colorado. And so we are the largest Indian reservation in the United States, and we call our home Diné. And I'm just going to continue on to.
Breanna, sorry, can I just stop? Can you just try and share your screen again? It just doesn't seem to be loading.
Okay, 1 second, sorry.
Sorry.
Is it? Is it sharing now?
Oh. No, I can't. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you.
Wait,
hopefully everyone can see that now.
Okay, so this was the first one, my name, and then my home, and then this one. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit, take you kind of quickly through history, I guess, more specifically what history was for Navajos and Thanksgiving, and also Navajos and the result of Thanksgiving and their relationship, I guess you could say, with the United States. So first off, I would like to start with the first Thanksgiving in 1621. That, for me, I couldn't really find any like details I didn't want to really share. Like I didn't want to, I just wanted to see where it was like what started it for me, I guess you could say, in my mind when I think of the first Thanksgiving. I think of this beginning ethnocentrism, especially in the United States, about because you could see that from this beginning there was the idea, I guess you could say, that within the first impressions between Native people and colonizers, but colonists, you could see that it wasn't a great relationship from the beginning, and it's not been a great history from the beginning. It's just like there was the initial mindset of they came into like uncivilized people, and this idea has trickled down to affect the way we modernly live our life. And I think that's very important for people to understand, that we very much feel that what has happened in the past directly affects what we're living in currently and more modernly. So in the years that follow the first Thanksgiving, there is this fear of the mixture of cultures, within not only the initial impression, but as you kind of got to live within close bounds of one another, you kind of see that settlers were very scared of their own people that had come with them overseas to go live with native people, because they didn't want them to adopt their mindsets or their culture, because it was just weird and it wasn't something they were used to, so they were very scared of it. And they also thought that we had been so uncivilized compared to themselves that they were fearing that we might change the way other people, especially people from their background, the way they thought and the way they lived. And it was just just a fear of culture mixing, and that led to increased intertribal warfare, because that's not to say there wasn't intertribal warfare prior to settlers coming. It was just that it increased even more so to like going into other tribes and completely almost decimating them, because when we had interacted prior to that, it was more of like, you weren't going in with the mindset of I'm going to take their land. You didn't really have this mindset of you need to expand in the way that there was obviously westward expansion from the colonies. And then that leads me to the BIA agents. So the first BIA, the BIA is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but prior to it being established as the BIA, it was known as the Committee on Indian Affairs, and it was first headed actually by Benjamin Franklin himself. And it was his job to oversee the trading with Native American tribes or native tribes, and kind of negotiating the tensions and stuff like that. But later on, as the CIA, I guess you could say, but it's the Committee on Indian Affairs, as it changed to the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it became more of a way as to have a watchdog on Native people and to ensure their assimilation, especially in an era of boarding schools and reservation establishment, which I'll get to. It was just kind of watchdogs on Native people to make sure they were assimilating to American culture. And yeah. So that leads me to reservation establishments and assimilations. So I'm going to start with Lincoln. And in 1862, he ordered the hanging of 38 Sioux men because he wanted to demonstrate to the Sioux people that the United States was a dominant force. And they were showing very much resistance to the settlers coming in and settling down and taking the land, and especially to American culture or white culture. And during his presidency, there was the Long Walk. The Long Walk was basically the displacement of Navajo people, and they were forced to walk hundreds of miles in the winter, and this covered from 1864 to 1866, and that brought us to the home that we are in now within the 4 Mountains. And it was under his presidency, but it was done by Confederate soldiers. And then following that, there was the Dawes Act, which was the more reservation era, I guess you could say, where reservations were established. So they would allocate land to Indians in the United States, but first they had to prove they were, I guess you could say, Indian enough is the way you see it written. They had to prove that they were Indian enough to be allocated land. And this brought in blood quantums. So blood quantums were actually the only population in the United States that has to have a certificate stating their blood quantum of their tribe. You get like a little paper and it tells you how much out of an eighth you are of the tribe. But through this land allocation, they could actually, if you were mixed blooded, you essentially you had to assume a US citizenship, and you couldn't be involved in your tribe, so you couldn't technically receive land. So this was a way they kind of kept most of the land and had to give some, but then also had to watch I guess you could say the disbursement of land. they could keep track of it and everything like that. And a reservation isn't, you don't get the title to the land and the land's yours and you can do whatever you want. A reservation, even still now, is it's basically what it is. It's a reservation. You're on the land temporarily, but when it comes down to it, federally, it's not your land, it's the United States' land. So we have very little and limited freedom, I guess you could say, within our own homes and what we could do. And especially during this time, because there was the introduction of boarding schools, and boarding schools prolonged until more recently, I guess you could say, throughout history. My grandparents are actually the first generation to have ended boarding schools, I guess you could say. They were the last to go to boarding schools. But in the beginnings, when boarding schools were established, they were established to assimilate Native Americans or Native children to American culture or white culture. They were taken from their homes, they were put in these schools, and they were taught to read and write in English. The boys, when they would arrive, their hair would be shaved off because it was uncivilized, and to have that kind of hair. They were taught how to read the Bible. They went to church, and obviously a lot of Native parents didn't want their children to leave the home, so even most parents would actually set up camps outside the school boundary because they wanted their children to know that they didn't choose to like send them and assimilate them away, because they were taken out of their home. They weren't just knocked on the door and said, "Can we have your kids?" No, they went into the homes forcefully and took the children. And so they wanted their children to know that they didn't abandon them. So a lot of parents kept close by, and you can even look this up, and there's photos of like the families camping outside, because this is not what people wanted. This is not, it was just not, it wasn't right. And so that eventually ended boarding schools. And yeah, so I'm going to lead more modernly to like what I find that we struggle from because of all of these things that have trickled down and affected the way we live our life now. So media representation and current social issues. Media representation is really problematic within the United States and outside of it, because when you think of a Native person or a Native individual, mostly the first thing that's going to pop into your head is Pocahontas. People know her from the Disney movie, and that's essentially all we're boiled up to. Like, that is the depiction of Native people in majority of people's minds. But I would just like to say that she is considered the first murdered and missing Indigenous woman. So that's an epidemic even modernly, because Native women are targeted, because there's this whole thing with the imbalance of powers. There's jurisdiction issues where you can't convict someone on this part of land, but you can over here, these cases are just lost and thrown out because it's a jurisdiction problem. And that goes into the reservation aspect of it and tensions between the tribal government and the federal government. But then also pipelines, that directly correlates to the land and the resources. Constantly you find that reservations are drained of their resources, and we as Native people are left on the land to figure out what to do with it, how to fix it, or some majority just leave because we can't live on that land anymore or drink from the water. And it's just like a drainage of resources, and it's like we already have limited resources, and this continues to like take it out. And then the third one is alcoholism. Alcoholism, I put this on here because this is a very stereotypical thing that pops into people's minds when they think of Native people. And you look at the statistics, and 6.8 more Native Americans need treatment for alcohol abuse or substance abuse than any other population, because of transgenerational trauma and just intergenerational trauma. Like, you see these problems trickle down and affect the way you interact with your own family, but then also the way you interact with the world. And then you're constantly put, I guess, like in a box. We're put on reservations and we've been kept there. And we're constantly given limited resources or no resources at all. And somehow that is, you expect people not to turn to something to try and remedy the way you feel. And so a lot of people turn to substances, and that's where substance abuse comes into play, especially alcoholism. And that's a big problem within the Native community. And it's sometimes the only way people can cope. And that's a large reason our population struggles, especially to kind of feel that there is an outside world, like, and we're welcome in it, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go on to talk about more currently how the day might be carried out by us as Native people, but then also by non-Native people. So I find that by non-Native people, it's more romanticized, and you see kind of, as previously stated in the other presentation by Alice, that you see these Thanksgiving specials just as you see Christmas specials, and you see people dress up as pilgrims and dress up as Indians, and they kind of just play out what you think happened. And this perpetuates the I guess ignorance of the actual holiday, because they don't ever educate you on what actually happened or what you should know. But more personally, as Native people, we find that we like the idea of the holiday in the sense that we're very grateful for still being here and still being a culture that's thriving on its own, but then also with other people's cultures. And we just find that we like the idea of the holiday, but not the actual historical context, because most people don't know what has happened within the first interactions that started America and everything that follows. Because what you constantly see is, I guess you could say, erasure of history of people of color. We're given a history book throughout our entire education system, and you don't see people of color highlighted as much as white people or Americans or settlers. Like, you constantly see these icons that are white people, but any people of color that are icons, they're very hard to find, or it's strange that they consistently find something they did wrong, like they drank before the legal age, and they're ultimately the worst human being possible because they did that one thing that was bad. It's like there are these icons that are, you find something wrong with them and make them a bad person, and that's not good, because then people of color don't have an icon to look up to themselves or see someone who made it, I guess you could say. But personally, we use it as a time to gather because we find that we understand each other more, because we know what happened, and we realize that history has already happened, and that's just something we have to deal with, but we have to recognize that it happened and continue on with the knowledge of what has happened. Like, you can't just pretend that none of that ever happened and that's not part of your history, I guess you could say. But what I want to talk about next is how the celebration of this holiday is harmful to Native people, how people celebrate it. It's not the best way, I guess, because the things that surround this holiday are just stereotypes or just completely inaccurate. So like I said, when people think of this holiday, they think of Pocahontas, but they don't know about her and about her family that had to go through like struggles. Her sister was kidnapped, and they told Pocahontas, if you don't come with us, then we're going to kill your sister. So she eventually had to come with them. Like, there's just so much of her as an individual that people don't know about. They just know that she fell in love with somebody and then left her people. But that's not actually what happened. And then secondly, decorations or like activities, especially education of young people for this holiday in particular, you constantly find that the best way people can educate young people is to make them dress up and partake in this activity, and half of them be pilgrims and half of them be Indians, and they reenact what happened. But you don't realize that in their mind, this basically tells them this is all Native people are. And it creates this impression of Native people that they just carry on throughout their lives, because you see it again in reenactments and costumes. You have to realize that traditional clothing is not a costume for other people. It's traditional clothing for those people. And reenactments of something that didn't actually happen in that way is just perpetuating ignorance and misknowledge about this holiday. And I don't think that this day should be completely dissolved and we shouldn't ever have a day where we can come together, because I think it's very important that my family uses this day to recognize who we are as people and come together with the knowledge of what has happened and be grateful that we're still here and that we are still able to be who we are. But I think it's very important that people go into this day with the knowledge of what happened, what actual history is, because I feel like we're very taught one-sided history. We're not taught everything that has happened and every person that was involved, because there's a lot that just is glossed over, and we're given this really shiny donut and we're like, here you go, this is American history, and that's all you get. But there's also the misconception that Columbus is associated with this holiday. He is not a very good figure in Native American communities. He's not, it's just, he's the guy who got lost and everyone reveres him for it. He's the guy who found the New World, but he has nothing to do with this holiday, and people don't even know what he did to Native people. A large part of like why we're so considered as uncivilized and this big ethnocentric idea stems from him and his first interactions with Native people. He is essentially the reason we are called Indians. He thought he was in India and decided to call Native people Indians, but there's a lot of, nobody seems to want to correct the narrative of history itself, I guess you could say, or even just this holiday. And I think it's very important that we go into each holiday realizing what each one is about, or who it involved, or how they're still here today, and history has been unkind to them, and it's been unkind to everybody, but we have to recognize that it's our own responsibility to go out and educate ourselves about what has happened to different people of different groups, not just Native people. And I wanted to bring it a little bit to a close with an intergenerational perspective, just so I don't have to like continue, so you don't feel as though I'm continuing to harp on history and about what I think, because I think it's very important that Native people are able to give their voices and people hear them. But I also wanted to include some of my family and people from my own tribe that and their thoughts on this holiday, because not everybody thinks the same, and I don't want to be the person that says something and that you think that's what all Native people think, because we all think very different things. And it's very important that you go in with the mindset in learning that there is like different sides to every story, and it's important to hear almost everyone and just kind of put them all together in your own mind, and not just think that one person serves as the speaker for the entire population, because I think that's very dangerous, especially now with different platforms that we go in thinking this one person represents what everybody thinks, because that's not true. Different people think different things. But I wanted to end on what some of my family members and people from my tribe had told me. So I asked them basically, what does Thanksgiving mean to you, or what comes to your mind when I say Thanksgiving? So first off, the so-called first Thanksgiving as the beginning of colonialism, I think that's very true, and I demonstrated that in my PowerPoint, I feel like. The next one is Thanksgiving. To me, is a day of mourning and a day to remember all the things we have endured as people. That's very important because we understand, like, what our people have gone through to bring us to now. And it's very important that you understand, like, what your own people have gone through, or your interactions with different peoples, because like I said, there's a large like erasure of history that we're not given, and it's hidden away because people don't like the way it sounds or the way it perceives of different people. So the next one is the true practice of tradition and culture are regarded as nonsense. Thus, the self-identity of natives has eroded. So this goes back to the first interactions, and even now, when you see somebody talking in their own language and dressing in their traditional clothing, some people still think today that it's weird to dress that way. It's weird to not speak English or to have an accent. Like, people even today experience the effects of ethnocentrism that started thousands of years ago, and we still can't come to the fact that people are different. They're going to look different. They're going to dress different. They're going to talk different. And you just have to be open to that, because not one culture dominates another. Not one culture is better than another. Not one people is better than another. Yeah, it's just very important to keep that, I guess, in your head. And another one is any and all economic development must have federal ownership. That goes back more to tribes, because it's important to realize that we are sovereign people, and we do have our own tribal government. We have our own president, and different tribes, but we generally, when it comes down to it, we have to be overseen by the federal government, because it's almost like an insult. Like, there's still that perspective of we can't do anything because we're unintelligible or we don't know enough to get by in the modern world. The next one is coming together as a family unit. I covered that a little bit when I mentioned that my family comes together during this day because we all know and understand the history of our people and this particular day and the people who were involved in this holiday. But I really wanted to emphasize the last one and end on it. Indigenous peoples have been caretakers of people, land, and animals. I think it's very important to realize that I don't want to like tell you that this is what happened and this is how we feel and this is essentially what white people are. It's more of, you need to realize there's multiple sides to every story, and we're not coming from a perspective of hate, or I'm not coming from a perspective of hate. I'm coming from a perspective of frustration that there's not enough education about this, or people don't implement the education about this in young people, or even just on TV or anything like that. Like, I would be shocked if I saw a special on TV during the Macy's Day Parade about Indigenous people and their interactions with settlers, and it just, we emphasize more the fact that we're still here and we're still people, and we just want to communicate and have people better understand where we're coming from and understand what we have endured as people to be where we are now. I think that's very important. And yeah, I think I want to end there. So I would like to say yeah, and thank you to listening to me. Thank you for being here. So I'm just gonna stop sharing.
Great, thank you so much. That was yeah, really fascinating. And thank you, thank you, Brianna, for sharing your personal history with us. I think everyone will be in agreement that that was very moving to hear. Yeah, so I think Alice, I'll just pass over to you now for a short discussion with Brianna, and then we'll be handing over to the audience. So get those questions in now, and then we'll try and answer as many as possible.
Sure, thank you. So Rihanna, do you think enough is done to educate those in schools about the truth of Thanksgiving and of Native American history in general?
No, I don't. Honestly, I can say that with certainty. I don't think there's enough. Um, Even just the people thinking of new ways of implementing that into the education system, I feel like that's kind of almost non-existent. I feel like if you wanted to include that, you really have to advocate for it. And I feel like kind of that's almost nonsensical in the way that you have to advocate for actual history to be taught. Um, and even more currently, like during your personal presentation, I heard the mentioning of World War II and like how this day was used as a day of like coming together as a national as a nation. But even people within that own like within that decade, I guess you could say, or even now, they don't know about Navajo people during World War II that essentially helped, I guess you could say, bring the war to an end, or help transmit very important conversations and codes between the Marines during that time. Like nobody knows about Navajo code talkers. And even in my own high school textbook, we were only given a short paragraph about, oh yeah, there were Navajo people in World War II and they helped, I guess, and that's it. But it's like they played a crucial part because they had developed a code that could be translated transatlantically and it was undecipherable. So it's just things like that that were just almost lost in history, like especially people of color. Like they're not given the credit, I guess you could say. They're just not given a role in history because most people of color did play a large and big role in history.
Thank you. So moving forward then, do you think you see the possibility of a positive change and how education might sort of play a role in this?
Oh yeah, of course. I don't think that we can take steps back. I think we can only go forward, and I think that it's very possible for us to turn around and just realize that there's other people involved in history and we can talk about them too and include them, because it's very important that there is diversity in history, because not only is it a historical thing for history to have taken place with different people, but it also is presently like people we are making history right now and there's different people involved. So it's very important to like include them.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I'll just there's a few questions coming in, so I will just quickly whiz through those if that's okay with you both. So this is directed towards Brianna. Bonetta has asked, what did Native Indians call themselves before? So I guess before colonization. I guess you were just your tribes.
That's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, I know before we were Navajos or before we were Indians or American Indians or Native Americans, we were just Diné. Like we're just exactly what our tribes are called. And you can see that like with a lot of different tribes. Like the Lakota people, they're Lakota. They're not it's just like we have what our tribes are. Either they're the direct translation from our actual languages, or they're just an English translation of what we used to call ourselves. But yeah, that's a really good question though.
And another one, do Native Americans have their own version of a day of thanks?
I'm gonna go with what my dad would say on this. We give thanks every day. I never heard of a particular day for Native people to set aside and give thanks. Especially within Navajo culture, I know that you are to rise early in the morning and give a prayer every day. Like you get up when the sun gets up and you say a prayer. And I feel like it's just more within indigenous and native cultures. It's more every day you say something to recognize that you're still here as an individual and as people. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. That's really lovely. Your dad's very right. There's also lots of people just saying thank you, and that they found it really interesting, that they learned a lot, which is great to hear. That was definitely our kind of mission with this. So thanks again both for sharing your kind of your histories and your stories. Someone has said that has asked, sorry, how does it feel going to school and learning about Native Americans? I guess, yeah, to Breanna, I guess, again.
Honestly, I feel like sometimes it's interesting, especially at a school like Notre Dame. I have heard some things by professors, and I'll just like call my mom and be like, you'll never guess what I heard today. It's so inaccurate and so generalized, I guess you could say, that it's almost like Native Americans are just one thing. Like we're not different tribes or anything. In some people's mindsets, we're just kind of taught as, here's all Native people in one circle and here's what they all do. But we're all very different. And just learning about it in school, I just kind of have to find myself constantly going to actual reliable sources and seeing what they say, not only at my college, but in in high school and middle school. I had to almost take it upon myself to find out things about my own people or other Native people, because we're just given a general, I guess you could say, Webster's dictionary version of all Native people in one circle, rather than we're not given details or names or anything. It's just kind of like a generalization of who we are as people. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, a great follow-up question with that is how do you think the portrayal of Native Americans as a monolith has led to erasure?
Oh, sorry.
So how has the portrayal of Native Americans as one single kind of entity led to the erasure of your culture, I guess?
Oh, okay, sorry. I don't, that's a very good question. It's very frustrating finding that people will come up to me and they will literally be like, oh, do you speak like this language or this language or this language? And I'm like, no. And then they'll ask me, oh, what language does your tribe speak? And I'll be like, okay, they speak Navajo. Do you speak Navajo? And I have to go into like, no, I don't. And they're like, oh, that's interesting. And it's almost like, sometimes I find myself like I don't fit in within my own community as much as I would like, because of what I've had to, I guess, assimilate to be able to not fully fit into another community, if that makes sense. I've had to almost adapt and change who I am depending on the community of people I'm with. And I think that's very true for any person of color or any Native American, because you find that you can't be too traditional, because then you're seen as like exotic or amazing or just a great display of your culture, and you just kind of want to be just who you are. You don't have to constantly be the representative of all Native people on this planet. It's just like it's not your, I just want young Native people to know that it's not your job to be the token Native person or the representative of who you are. If you don't speak your own language, that's fine. If you do, that's amazing. Like, you don't have to constantly change yourself to fit into what they expect Native people to be, or to be the perfect demonstration of what we can be as Native people assimilating into white culture. Like, I think that's very dangerous when people walk up to you and you're like, oh yeah, I'm Navajo, and they say, wow, your English is great. Like, that's not the compliment you think it is. And I think consistently in your head as a young Native person or a person of color, you're like, what did they mean by that? and then you go home and you're like, do I not speak my own language because of other people? Or it's just like within ourselves, we have our own like battles, I guess you could say, and everyone does. But when you say those kind of sideways comments to different people of color, it makes them almost insecure about fitting into every community that they find themselves in.
Yeah, no, yeah, that was really powerful. Yeah, I think also the work, obviously the work that you're starting to do with the kind of campaigning for this, I think it's going to be really kind of beneficial to future generations. So yeah, you should be really proud of kind of all the work that you're doing with especially with like this talk and everything. So, oh gosh, sorry, I'm trying to get through these questions. So someone has actually asked Alice a question, and they want to know how did Alice become interested in American history, and specifically Benjamin Franklin? Great question.
Oh God, I'd say my interest in American history sort of specifically began sort of mainly through school. We were taught very little of sort of the founding American history, sort of like through like GCSE level. I don't know what the equivalent of that is in America, I'm afraid. So like ages of like up to 16. And then 16 to 18, I went on and did it at college. And it was at college that we did like the American Revolution and the founding fathers. And I think that I don't know what exactly it was, but that really struck a chord with me. And I really found that really interesting in terms of like the history of ideas and the exchange of ideas between these individuals and how this then led to become like led to American independence essentially. And I thought being able to track the sort of chronology from like the at least like the early 1700s, even if not earlier, being able to track through the sort of letters and the writings of these people and see how the Enlightenment has come over from Europe into America and then made its way into sort of like the hearts and minds of the people, I thought was really fascinating. It was something I pursued at university, ended up doing my dissertation on sort of the American Enlightenment, and then my love of Benjamin Franklin came from there, really. I did a lot of my work centered around him, and yeah, I thought he was really fascinating. It just started a lifelong passion.
Well, we for sure are very grateful for that lifelong passion. So I'm sure the audience will agree. So I'm just going to read a couple more, just because I'm conscious that we are kind of running out of time before the big game tonight. So I don't want to I don't want to impose on people's time in too much. Someone has asked, so Mike said there's a statue of John Smith in the city of London as the founder of Jamestown in Virginia. Interesting. But I've often thought that it should be a statue of Pocahontas. Do you agree, Breanna?
Oh, that's that's a very tricky question. I honestly I don't know. Honestly, their contact was very limited. They were not in love as the Disney movie portrays. I'm so sorry if I shattered anybody's illusion of that. But that was certainly not the case. They had limited contact, like I said. They almost didn't even know each other. She's not the person he married when she came here to England. She married another man. She assumed a Christian name. But no, I don't think so. I'm gonna have to go with no, just because I feel like because of the life she lived and what she had to endure, maybe it would be more sensitive to her as an individual, I guess you could say, to have her statue, if you wanted one, in America, because essentially that's where she's from and that's where her home is. And yeah, I think that she's maybe, yeah, I'm just kind of trying to think about like what she would have wanted, I guess, or like the life she led and the way she would have wanted to, I guess, be or be seen as.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's yeah, very hard question. Just right, so I'll just do one more, I think. So can you speak about the relationship between Christianity and Indigenous American people?
Okay. I want to remind everyone, this is my perspective of it, personally. Personally, I find it very hard to see it as a positive light, especially because within the establishment of boarding schools, and during that time, it was essentially nuns and priests that were forcing this assimilation of young Native people to white culture. Like, it was essentially, they were brought to change them and erase their identity as a Native person and create them to be a more suitable representative of what you could be as a Native person in white America. So I think the relationship there obviously has to be very rocky and not great. Yeah, I think it's a very sensitive topic for Native people, I find. But there's also, people look to this because it is, I guess, a support system that helps a lot of Native people. Yeah, so I do know that a lot of Native people are Christians, and they believe in it firmly. There's also our own traditional thoughts on it. We have our own, I guess you would call it mythology, but we have our own traditional practices. We have our own gods. We have our own creation story. It was orally passed down, and it's only more recently in modern day been transcribed to books and printed and stuff like that. But I think there's, yeah, there are Native Christians. There are non-Christians that are Native. But yeah, I think that the relationship between, I guess, the church and Native people hasn't always been the best, and but some people still follow the church, and that's great. That's something that helps them. So I feel like if it's something that helps you, then who am I to say don't do that? You know, like, it's just, you find what helps you and what supports you as an individual. Yeah, but I think the relationship between the church and Native people needs to be taught also a lot more than it is now, because a lot of people don't know that it was actually the Church of England and Catholics and Christians that had come into the United States and established these schools. And the only reason these schools were dissolved was in the Depression, because there was no funding to continue these schools from anybody. So I think that you kind of just have to realize that there is a sordid history there, and it's important to learn it. But yeah, I mean, people are always gonna believe in things, and they're all gonna be different. Nobody's the same, like I said. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, obviously, yeah, you can't speak for everyone, but no, that was a great answer. Thank you. So I think we're probably going to wrap up around now, but someone has just told us that there is a monument to Pocahontas at Jamestown, Virginia. So that's really nice to know. So thank you for sharing that. So yeah, sorry we didn't get around to answering all of your questions. But if you do have any real pressing things that you do want to ask us, then please just get in touch with us and we will try and answer them as soon as possible. You can contact us at info@benjaminfranklinhouse.org. I'll just repeat that. So it's info@benjaminfranklinhouse.org. Yeah, and as I say, we will definitely get back to you as soon as possible. As I say, the talk will be available on our website and our YouTube channel as well in the next few weeks, hopefully. Just before we end, I will quickly remind you all just to take a quick look at our website because we do have a few events coming up. So please do check those out as well. As we come to the end of the year, we are taking kind of a deep dive into the Georgian Christmas traditions. And we'll be thinking about how Benjamin Franklin might have celebrated the holiday with his British family here at 36 Craven Street. And there are events both in-house and virtually. So hopefully there is something for everyone. But a massive thank you to to Alice and Breanna for this evening. It was truly eye-opening and a really fascinating discussion. And I know that a lot of the audience members are very grateful. We've have had some great comments coming through, so that's really lovely to see. But yes, I will let you all go because I'm sure everyone is eager to get their TVs on to watch the game. So I will leave you with saying, let the best team win. Thank you, everyone, and yeah, hope to see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.